We've got a bird. We've got some spikes. Our game's done, right? I mean, what else is there to do? Oh, right. Like everything. All right, let's jump into it. You ready? Then let's learn some game dev. So here we are in the Spike Manager, picking up right where we left off. The goal of today is to get our spikes set up so that they are rotated properly, that we are choosing from a variety of spikes, and that everything looks and works exactly as we would expect. So, how do we go about that? Well, if you remember, this function here does actually return something. If we open up the manual, we can look and see that what it returns is a real, which is a number. It can be a whole number or a fraction, like a decimal. And it says it's the instance ID of that value. Okay, so an instance is something in our game. So if we look at our room, these spikes are instances. This bird is an instance. And if we look over here on our room instance layer properties, we can actually see each one of these has a unique identifier, their ID. So if we want to do something with this spike as opposed to this spike, we need to have the ID of that, and then we can change its properties. Okay, so that's how it all works. Now, to grab the ID from this function, we need to save it just like we've done up here with this choose function. And because we only need to access it in this event, we're going to say var spike equals. This line is important. I mean, every line of code we do is pretty important, but this line specifically, we're going to be using this variable here. So you need to create it, assign it to this function, and then we're going to start altering this spike that we make. So the first thing we're going to do is check to see if we need to rotate it. So we're going to say if, we're going to open it up, and now to find out anything about this spike that we have made, we access it with a period. So we put the name of the spike in there, and in this case, the ID of the spike we have stored in this variable. So we put the variable name and a period. And now you can see that it's got all these built-in variables here. If we keep scrolling down, there's even more of them. And this is all stuff that we can now access. So if we want to change something or check something, we can do that. We are no longer talking about the properties of this spike manager. YSpawn is in the spike manager. The variable spike is in the spike manager. The alarm and this variable spawn rate are all in the spike manager object. This now, although this code is running from the spike manager, we're actually affecting a specific instance of a spike. The spike that we just created. So we're going to check to see if its y is equal to 0. And if it is, then we're going to change and rotate it. Now, how do we rotate something? We've done it in here before. So if we click on this and we zoom in, we can actually see that there's something called rotation. At the top, it's set to 180. At the bottom, it's set to 0. That means that we need to rotate it, if it's at the top, 180 degrees. So, again, we say spike dot, and this time it's not rotation, although there is something in here called rotation and phi rotation. This is not at all what we're looking for. Instead, it's actually called image underscore angle. And we set that equal to 180. Now, something important that I will note right here, and I did a parenthesis there for some reason, ignore that. Something important to note is this is accessing one individual spike, just the one we made. If at any point we wanted to access everything about the spikes, like every single instance of the spike, we could actually say obj spike dot y, or image angle. This would go into every single instance of the object and change that property. So here, spike is one instance. It's just an ID. This is the entire object reference. It's going to affect every single one in your game. So be very careful when you do that. It can do some things you don't expect, and it might be that it's not actually what you want to do. Because in this case, we don't want to see if any of the spikes are at Y0. We already know that they are. And we wouldn't want to change every single one to be image angle 0 or image angle 180, because then the bottom spikes are going to be disappearing into the ground. We are changing one spike, checking this spike's Y, and changing its angle, and that's all. Let's run the game and see if it works. We should now see the spikes that weren't there before because they were way up high are now available. You see them here? So there's this gap in between is 100 frames in game time, and now we have an infinite variety or an infinite amount of spikes. We're going to add the variety in just a second. So that takes care of all of the spikes in our game. They are visible and they are where they should be. Now, we're going to add some variety. And that's because just the size right there, it's not that much of a challenge. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to say spike dot image Y scale. Here is another built-in variable that controls information about our object or our instance here. So if we were to drag this instance and make it taller, you can see the scale Y value is actually changing. And that is what we want to change through code. So these labels don't match up entirely inside of code. Some of them do, like image speed. That's actually a built-in property that we can control, but rotation is called image angle. But knowing that they're here is a good first start, because then anything that you can change through the GUI, through the buttons, or through the room editor, you can also change in code. So we want to change the image Y scale, and what we're going to do is a random range. This is a function that will return a random value between two numbers. So we don't want it to be 0 to this number. We want it between 1, which is its normal size, and 1.6. So it will return one of these numbers, and then it will set the spike that we just made to that size in the Y. So let's go ahead and give it a try. We should see ones that are larger, but not ones that are smaller. So that's exactly what we're getting. And it adds some variety to our game, and it also adds some difficulty, because these spikes, when they change their image Y, it does follow and change their collision mask. So the sprite that you see there, you can still collide with it just as you would expect. Now it's time to add some different spikes. So in our sprites, we brought in a bunch of different spikes here. We've got 4 different options, and right now all we're using is 1. So to change a sprite, or to change what sprite is on an object, we call spike dot sprite index. So this controls the sprite associated with this object. Now, which ones do we want to set it to? There's a couple different ways to do this. We could go in and we could set this equal to choose, and then we could pass in every single one. So SPR large spike, SPR single spike, and so on and so forth, and that would work. But this is also a really good opportunity to talk about arrays, something that we haven't discussed yet, but are a very powerful concept in coding, and actually kind of the base of all complexity once you start working with data structures and larger games. So let's talk about arrays by going into the create event. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called spikes. Now, it's not a sprite. We are creating a variable here. And this variable is going to be an array. Just like this variable is an integer, because an integer is a whole number, this one is going to be an array. And an array is a way of holding multiple values inside of one variable. So think of it like a list. If you've ever made a list for anything, which I'm sure you have, this is a way to create a list. The cool thing about this is we can fill it up, we can take things away, and later on you can also do really advanced things like sorting it or filtering it, taking things out that don't match. You can display everything in an array by using a for loop. There's a lot of power inside of here. But for now, we're going to keep it really simple, and we're just going to say spikes equal. And now, just like we did in the alarm right here, we're going to open up a bracket. So I call the square brackets a bracket. So this is a bracket here, and we're going to put the sprites of everything that it can be in here as a list. So it doesn't matter the order. We'll say single spike, SPR large spikes, SPR medium spikes, and SPR small spikes. Now I put a comma between each one and I close it with a right bracket. Now this is an array because we have created it like this. We can also create it like this. Spikes 0 equals SPR single spike. This would do the exact same thing, and we could go down the list and we could say spikes 1 equals this, spikes 2 equals this, and spikes 3 equals that. And you'll notice this syntax, the way we write this, is very similar to an alarm. And that's because the alarm is actually an array, and it has 12 indices or indexes. This 0 here is an index. It's how you access this array. So if you have a list of items and you talk about an item on that list, you need to have some way to know which one you're talking about. Let's say you've got a grocery list and you're marking it down as you go through and you're saying, hey, I need to pick up item 7. Well, you said item 7, so we know which one it is in the list. Now, in a grocery list, sure, you might actually say, hey, I'm going to go pick up the roast beef or the cereal or something like that. You can tell I'm a little hungry. But in coding, oftentimes we don't actually know what's in an array because the values can change any time. We could change these values while the game is running, and our code would still work to choose from the list because all we're saying is grab the first index. Now, we have a 0 here, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, so let's hit on it. This is how computers start counting. They start at 0. So when we talk about arrays or alarms, or sometimes a lot of different things in coding, we start at 0. 0 is the new 1. So if we want to access the first alarm, just like we did, we say alarm 0. And if we want to access the first spike, we say 0. So I'm going to delete that. Now we're going to go back into our alarm. And now we want to choose one of these sprites and set it to this spike. And we can do that by accessing it like this. Spikes, open up that bracket, and we just need one of them inside of here. So we need 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 because we start at 0 and we go up to 3, which is 4 altogether. I know, new math is fun. Now we want this to be a random number, so we could use the function random, but when working with arrays, you must use whole numbers or integers. If we said 2.1, GameMaker is going to throw a fit. If we said -5, well, that's below 0 and that can't work, so GameMaker will throw a fit. If we said 10, GameMaker will throw a fit because we haven't defined what that value is. We only have it defined up to 3. So we're going to say I random. I stands for integer, which means a whole number, 1, 2, 3, not 1.1, 2.65. It'll only return a whole number. And in this case, we're going to put 3. So it will return either 0, 1, 2, or 3. That's all it can return. This is a very finite randomness here. Without the I, it will return a decimal, or at least it can, and that will cause an error. So this here now is accessing an array, which is just a variable, but it's a special kind of variable that can hold a list. We open it up to access it with these brackets, and we pass in a number. Now, we could also do this to make it a little more legible. We could say var index equals irandom3. That will allow us to create a local variable, and then instead of having a function inside of here, we can actually pass in that variable. So this would say spikes index, and then we have a number. So let's run it and try this out. If we do this, and we get over here, we will now see that the spikes are changing their sprites. And unfortunately, I died right there. Let me try again. But you saw that it was happening. So we've got some that are different. We've got lots of different varieties here, and they are changing their size. And I think it looks really good. And it's exactly what we're looking for. So we now have an endless runner with our Flappy clone. We have different sized spikes, and we have different sprites for those spikes, which is awesome. And we used and learned about arrays, which are really, really powerful. The reason I'm talking about them now is because as you progress in your journey of game development or just programming, you will use arrays all over the place. Okay? Almost any game, you will use an array. Any advanced data structure, which is a way of holding data with even more functionality, such as a grid. So like, a grid like a square. So you got 0, 0, 1, 0. That's just two arrays or multiple arrays stacked together. And anytime you want to do something big, like an inventory, a game that is displaying a graphic for health, you might use an array with a for loop. Really, there's an infinite amount of options here, but trust me when I say you will use arrays all the time. And learning how to create them and learning how to access them and learning what works and doesn't work is important. So I'm going to throw a -1 inside of here, and our game is going to crash after 100 frames. So I have to wait that long. Now, the error you get is a little weird. It says push execution error, variable index -1, out of range 4. And then it tells you where it's at. That means the variable, the index that we passed in, is not a valid range. It's either too little or too high, or in this case, a negative number, because it doesn't exist. Spikes -1 is not a thing. And spikes -1 specifically can never be a thing, because we can never go below 0. You'll get the exact same error if you try to access 5 or even 4 in this case, because we haven't set it. Now, another nice thing about arrays is that they are very scalable. If at any time we wanted to add more spikes in here, all we have to do is add them in right here and change this number. And then it will choose those new sprites that we added. So spikes are scalable and flexible and very powerful. And that's because they are an array. Now, if you're struggling with arrays or the concept itself doesn't make sense, rewatch this video. Go on my channel. I've got some explanations on arrays in a different format with different code, and maybe that will help. But at the very least, continue on, and the more you hear me talk about it, the more you see them, the more it's going to sink in. And one day, you'll just have a light bulb moment when things start to click. Now, it might be in a day or two, it might be in a month or two, it might be in a year or two, It took me a very long time the first time I learned about arrays because I just couldn't grasp them. They didn't make any sense to me. They caused me to drop out of college and switch to a different degree because I could not understand arrays. So don't feel bad if it doesn't make sense. Take some time, breathe, keep going, or go back and rewatch what we're talking about until at least some of it starts to make some sense. You don't have to have it all down at the beginning. This is still the beginner series. Take it slow. Ask lots of questions if you have them. I hope you found this helpful. And again, ask questions if you have them. And as always, keep making, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next video.